Hey guys, welcome to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel. My name's Austin and today we're going to be continuing the lift series on this 99 Cherokee. We're doing a 3-inch suspension lift by Rough Country. If you guys saw in the last video, we knocked out the rear suspension, got that all squared away. Now it's time to do the front. So let's get started. Alright, so here's the lift kit that we're going to be installing today. First off, I would like to thank Rough Country for sending this out and making this possible. But with this lift kit, it is a 3-inch lift kit for the Cherokee. As you know, they have a front coil spring suspension up front and then they got leaf sprung in the back. Instead of going with the add-a-leaf option, I went with the full leaf packs. That way I don't have to worry about my old springs still being saggy. So with all the components in our kit, obviously we have our leaf springs, we got our coil springs, and then we got fixed lower control arms up front. This is going to help correct our caster angle when we lift the Jeep 3 inches. We also got sway bar drop brackets right here, so that's going to correct the angle for our sway bar. And over here we have 4 sets of U-bolts. Obviously we're going to be using one for either side where the leaf springs go. Since these Jeep Cherokees came with a variety of axles, they have a 3-inch U-bolt and then they got 2 3/4 U-bolts. So if you have a Chrysler 8 1/4 rear end like I am, we're going to be using these 3-inch U-bolts. And if you either have the Dana 44 or Dana 35, we're going to be using these 2 3/4 U-bolts over here. Then along with that, we got nuts and washers. Now as far as shocks, Rough Country actually sent me 2 different kinds. So we're going to be first installing these N3 series shocks, which is their new nitrogen charged shocks. And in the past, I've actually had a Rough Country lift that had the N2 shocks, and I really didn't have any good luck with that. A lot of times the seals kept leaking and they just kept blowing out just from daily driving, and I didn't off-road a whole lot. But they say all the problems with the N2s has been resolved in these N3s, so we're going to try these out first. I'm going to put some hard miles on the road and do a little off-roading too and see how these hold up and see how they ride. That's going to be in a later video. I'm going to do a review on these. And once we tested out these shocks, we're going to be replacing them with the Rough Country V2 monotube shocks, which are really high quality in my opinion. It is a $400 option if you decide to get it with your lift kit. But we're going to be testing those as well, see how they do on-road and how they do off-road, and then we'll compare the two in a later video. So a few other things that I got that I'm going to replace while I'm in here doing the suspension lift kit. One is I got new upper coil seats for the front. Since this Jeep has 300,000 miles, they're probably all worn out. Along with that, I got some sway bar bushings. I did replace these a couple of years ago actually in this vehicle, but they seem like they got some wiggle room in there. I also got some extended bump stops that we're going to be installing in the front. I got a video for replacing the rear bump stops that I'll post in the description below if you want to know how to do that. We're also going to be replacing the rear shackles that the rear leaf springs attach to. These ones right here are SKP and they're the cheapest ones I could find. And I actually got them off of Rock Auto for about 30 bucks, and they came with 2 bolts per shackle, and then they also came with the replacement leaf spring bushings. So if these bushings and the leaf springs go bad, I can always replace it with this one. And also Rough Country also sent me flag nuts for the rear shocks. As you guys know, the upper bolts for the rear shocks like to snap off. You can pound out that welded nut and replace it with these flag nuts right here, and it makes it a lot easier. Hopefully I don't have to use these today, but as you guys saw in my rear shock replacement video, I actually got lucky with the bolts actually coming out, and I put some anti-seize on those bolts, so hopefully they come out nicely today. Alright, so with part 2 for the suspension video, we're going to be starting on removing the old components that are up front on the front suspension and replacing it with the new stuff we have right here. Alright, so with the Jeep up in the air, we got the tires and wheels off. I'm going to start by removing our front shocks. I'm going to start over here on the axle side that has the 2 5/16 bolts. They're going to be a 1/2 inch because they've been replaced before. If you have factory hardware, that's going to be a 13 millimeter. We'll get the axle side disconnected on both shocks, then we'll lower the Jeep back down and disconnect it from the top side because it's inside the engine bay. So I'm going to zip these off with an impact. All right, so looking underneath the hood here, we got our top ends of the shocks that are mounted to the inner fender. One of them's right here underneath the master cylinder, and it's going to be a little bit harder to get to because we can't use a ratchet. So you can use a wrench or a ratcheting wrench if you want. This nut right here is a 9/16, but I got a 14 millimeter ratchet wrench that's going to fit on there nicely. A little trick that I think I read in the comments section on one of my videos is just put a wrench on here, and you can grab the tube body and you can actually twist this off. It actually works a lot better than having to go back and forth with the wrench in this small area. So I'm going to go and remove this one that way. Alright, so once you have that nut off, we can pull off all the hardware on the upper side over here. And then we can just wiggle the shock from underneath, and then it just drops down right below. And then we got our old shock out. And then over here on the passenger side shock, it's going to be a little bit easier. I'm just going to take a 9/16 on a couple extensions, hook it up to my impact, and zip it off. It is located down here. It's kind of hard to see in the camera, but it's directly behind this overflow tank. And then same thing, take our nut and our hardware, and then the shock drops down below. Alright, so with both of the front shocks removed, I'm going to go and lift up the Jeep again, and then we'll get started on removing the sway bar. Alright, so I'm going to start by unbolting the sway bar from the Jeep and the axle. This way it's going to be a little bit easier installing those drop brackets for our front sway bar. And I'm basically just going to unbolt it from the sway bar link up here. This is a 11/16 nut. I'm just going to put a little bit of PV Blaster on there since I've actually replaced these sway bar links about a couple years ago, so they shouldn't be the original ones. If you do have the original ones on there, more than likely that bolt's going to snap no matter what you do. But once we get that off, I think the suspension will come down a little bit more because the axle weight is on that sway bar system. Then once we got the sway bar links disconnected, we'll go and unbolt it from the Jeep side up here. Make sure you grab your hardware because you're going to end up reusing it. So with that unbolted, I'm going to go and do the other side as well. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is remove the sway bar from the Jeep, and on either side of the frame rail we got two 15mm bolts holding in the sway bar, and I did actually have these out before, so I'm not too concerned that they'll snap, but I'm going to take a ratchet and break them free by hand first, so that way I know the bolt isn't yielding and I know it won't snap. If these bolts have never been removed on your Jeep before, you really want to make sure you don't snap them here because it's a pain in the butt trying to retap a hole since there is a welded nut inside the frame and you can't really access it at all. What you can do is shoot some PV Blaster up through these access holes and try and make it into where that welded nut is. But for me, I got some anti-seize on these bolts, so I'm hoping they're just going to break free. Alright, so I got all four bolts broken free. Now I'm just going to zip them off with the impact. Make sure you have a hand on the sway bar once you get the last bolt off. Alright, so now the next thing I'm going to do is actually lower the Jeep back down so that way the front axle is on jack stands so some of the weight is supported on the axle. And from there, I'm going to unbolt both of the lower control arms from the axle and Jeep because we have to replace that anyway with the lift kit. And once we do that, we're going to jack up the Jeep once again, and then we should be able to pop out those coil springs. Alright, so with the Jeep lowered down and some of the weight of the axle on jack stands, we're going to go and remove our lower arms. Now they're attached on 2 points, one on the Jeep side over here and one on the axle side. These bolts right here are going to be 21mm, the same as your rear leaf spring bolts. They generally come out a little bit easier than the leaf spring bolts, so I should be able to zip these out with an impact nicely. And because of the fact that I just replaced these not too long ago. So I'm going to get a wrench on the back side and then impact it from the front. Now make sure you hang on to these bolts because we're going to be reusing it when we install our new lower control arms. Alright, so for removing this bolt over here on the axle, to give us a little bit more room, I'm just going to turn the wheel to the passenger side to get this driver's bolt out. So I got my impact swivel right here, and it fits perfectly right behind here with the brake caliper in the way. And now I'm just going to take my wrench on the back side and zip this off. Alright, so our axle shifted slightly. That's fine because that's what we want it to do. Now I'll hit and try and get this removed. There we go. Now we'll do the same thing to the other side. Alright, so with both of our lower control arms removed, I'm going to start by jacking up the vehicle again. That way the axle can droop even more and we should have less limitations. One thing to keep in mind is your brake lines. I still have the factory brake lines right here, so I'm just going to have to watch and make sure that the axle is not hanging by the brake lines. If it is getting tight and I still need more room, I can just remove the caliper and just hang them up out of the way for now. But by lifting this up, we should be able to sneak out our coil springs. Alright, so my brake lines are kind of tight, but it's not holding up the vehicle right now. But as you can see, we unseated the coil from up here. The last thing that's holding in this coil spring is our retainer down here on the axle. It's just a simple clip that's covering part of the bottom coil, and that's just going to be held in by a 13mm bolt. So we'll go and remove that on both sides right away. Alright, so with that retainer removed, we can take our coil spring, lift it up out of the lower seat, and then find a good way that's easy as possible to remove it from the vehicle. Alright, so we got that removed. Let's do the same exact process on the other side. Alright, so it's going to be a little bit tighter over here because the axle's not dripping as much. But what we can do is just put a foot over here on the knuckle side, and then it should tilt the axle. And then while you're pushing down, kind of wiggle out the spring. And there we go. So now while we're in here, I'm going to go and remove our old bump stops and our old coil seat. As you can see, my old bump stops are no longer in existence, at least on this side, so I don't have to worry about removing that. As far as the coil seat up here, this should just be able to slide down. I'm going to get a screwdriver up here actually and just kind of wedge it in between, and then we should be able to pry it down. And good thing we're replacing this because this thing is just falling apart. As you can see, it's just rusting from the inside where the metal is, and then the rubber is all destroyed on the outside. Alright, so now I'm going to take our new coil seat and reinstall it. I'm just going to take a little bit of WD-40 and put it right here so that way it slides on a little bit easier. Now instead of reinstalling our new bump stops, since they are extended, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to install that and then install the coil spring. So what we're actually going to do is install the coil spring and bump stop at the same time. We're basically going to have the bump stop inside the coil spring while we set the coil spring in place, and then once that's in place, we can get in between the coil spring and push up on that bump stop, and that should set it in. The reason being is that this axle is basically as low as it can go without removing any more components, and to make less work for ourselves, we can just get it done that way. But as far as the upper coil seat, I'm going to go do the same thing to the other side. All right, so over here on the driver's side, I got the upper coil seat all installed right here, and I actually have a bump stop kind of installed, and I figured if I can get it in a little bit and just kind of angle it, it's going to make it a lot easier to push in that bump stop once the coil spring's in. So I kind of test fit it a little bit, and I think it's going to work. So we're going to install our coil and come in on an angle like this and kind of feed it through and move the bump stop if so need be. And then we can swing it over and install it over here onto the lower coil seat that's on the axle. So over here we got our new 3-inch lift spring. So I'm going to raise this up as high as it can go. And then I'm just going to put some pressure on the axle, see if I can get some more wiggle room, and then we'll try and set it into place. Alright, so I got that coil spring installed there. It took a little finagling, but I just used a pry bar on the bottom here, kind of pried up on the spring and pushed it, and then eventually set into the place over here. I got it clocked in the correct position by the way it sits in the coil seat on the axle down here. As you can see, it's still a little bit crooked. That's because we don't got the lower control arms in and the axle's at full droop, so I can't correct the rear angle that the bump stop's doing right now until we get those control arms in, and then we can raise up the vehicle a little bit. Then everything will straighten out. And at that point also we can install our coil retainer. But for now I'm going to do the same thing and install the other side coil spring. Alright, so over here, as you can see, the axle is a little bit higher, not as low as the other side, and that's because it's kind of getting hung up on the steering because the steering is fully maxed out. So if we can't get this in here, we'll just unbolt one of our linkages for our steering, and then we should be able to sneak this coil in without using a coil compressor. So it's kind of tight putting in this coil spring, so I'm just going to remove this tie rod end right over here. That should give us a little bit more room to install this. Okay, so I went and got that coil spring in place. I ended up having to just put all my weight on this side of the axle, and it got it down far enough. And then I went and rebolted our tie rod back into place, so that way that's all ready to go. Next thing we can do is install our new lower control arms, and our new lower control arms are going to be symmetrical, so they're the same on both sides, so it doesn't matter which end you put where. And I'm just going to loosely install them on the axle side first on both sides, and then we're going to see how our alignment is when it goes up to the frame, and then we might have to shift the axle one way or another to get those holes to line up. So I'm just going to feed our bolt in. I put some anti-seize inside the bushing as well as on the bolt, so that way if I have to take these off again, they'll come out nicely. Then I'm going to put our nut on the back side. And then raising up this arm, as you can see, we are significantly off. The axle has to go like 3 inches forward. So to get the axle to come forward, there's a few ways you can do. You can just kind of lift it up and see if it kind of lines up into place, which I might try first. Otherwise, you can use a ratchet strap and kind of ratchet the axle to move one way or another. Otherwise, you can do it by brute force and see if you can push it with your leg or something like that. Alright, so this is what I got going on over here on the passenger side. I just got a ratchet strap going through an access hole on the frame here, and then I have it wrapped up around the axle. And I basically tightened it up a little bit more, and it shifted the bottom part of this axle outward. So now we can actually hook up our lower control arm over here since the holes line up. So now with our holes lined up, I'll take our bolt and feed it through. And then we'll just take a nut on the back side and loosely install these. We won't torque down the lower control arm bolts until we get the full weight of the Jeep back down on the front axle here, so that way we don't have any premature wear on our bushings. Alright, so with this side lower arm installed, we'll go and do the other side. Alright, so over here on the driver's side, it was the opposite thing I had to do. The axle is too far forward, so I had to push it back. And to do that, I have a ratchet strap going from the axle over here, and I tied it around the cross member to kind of shift the axle backward. So now I got our hole all lined up, and I got some anti-seize on my bolt, and I'm just going to push it into place. Alright, so I'm not getting the bolt going all the way through. That's because this lower control arm is kind of twisted inside of here, and that's due from the axle not being centered underneath the Jeep currently. So I'm just going to take the track bar and extend it out so that way it pushes the axle back this way, straightens out this little joint in here, and that way we should be able to hammer this bolt all the way through. Alright, so once I finished with his lower control arms, I got the front end of the Jeep on its own weight. So I just got some jack stands underneath the front axle here and lowered down the Jeep a little bit. So now we got compression in our coils right here, so we can take our bump stop and push it up all the way into place. You can use something long to kind of pry in here with the coils. That way it kind of pushes up on that bump stop, because sometimes it can be a pain in the butt, especially on this driver's one, because it's so full of rust in here, everything's really tight. So we can do that as well as reinstall our coil retainers, so that's what I'm going to do right now. We got our little bracket that's going to sit right here, and then we got our 13mm bolt. Put some anti-seize on there, and now we can thread it into place. Now once that is installed, we can do the same thing on the other side. Alright, so we got the retainer for this side. And then we can tighten it up. Alright, so now I'm going to install our new front shocks. I'm going to start over here by bolting it onto the axle first, and then we'll cut the strap, and it's going to rise up all the way to the inner fender here, where it's going to bolt inside the engine bay for the upper end. Alright, so I have that loosely attached till we get the top over here. That way we're not fighting this bushing over here on the bottom when trying to line it up over here. Alright, so before we cut this strap free, we got to make sure that we get this hardware in here before this thing reaches the top. That way we're not trying to fight it. So basically for the hardware on the bottom side, we have our metal retainer that's going to hold in our bushing. And for this bushing right here, they got a little bit of a lip. That lip is going to face towards the inner fender, and then on that top side, it's going to be flipped upside down, facing the inner fender as this little lip is going down towards this hole. So unfortunately, this strap is kind of in the way of the rod, so I'm going to try my best on holding this down as I put this in here, and then it should rise up towards that hole. Oh, that didn't work. Yeah. Alright, so I just had to press that down a little bit, but now we'll finish tightening it up on the bottom here, and then we'll go put the hardware on top of the shock, and then we should be done here. Alright, so for installing the upper end of the shock, once again we're going to take our bushing with that little lip, and we're going to have that face down, and then we're going to take our metal piece and have the dome shaped up. And then we can take our nut and thread it on. Then I'm going to take my ratchet wrench and tighten it up so that way the rubber bushing bulges out. And same thing with this side with the shock. And once again, for this upper shock mount that's located behind this reservoir over here on the passenger side, we got our bushing that the nub is going to go straight down. We got our metal piece, and then we got our nut. Alright, so the last component that we have to install is our sway bar drop brackets, and that's what these guys are right here. Basically, it drops it down about a couple inches and also shifts where the sway bar is going to bolt to by putting it forward a little bit. And it's adjustable too by these slotted holes, so that way you can get your sway bar angle just right. So we're going to install it onto the frame rail first, and we're going to have the closed off side facing the outside, and we're going to use our factory hardware. So our two 15mm bolts, we're going to bolt that up to the frame here. Alright, so I'm going to leave that finger tight until we get the sway bar on, and then we'll see what our angles are at. But as you can see, it's adjustable by this sliding back and forth. Then there's also slotted holes down here where our sway bar is going to bolt to, so this thing has a lot of adjustment. But now we can do the same thing and install this bracket on the other side. It's going to be the same exact thing, except mirror opposite. Alright, so I went ahead already and replaced the bushings that are on the sway bar over here off camera, so that's all ready to go. So now we're going to take our sway bar and we're going to hook it over the sway bar links over here, so that way it's kind of held in on both sides, and then we'll line it up to the bracket and then feed our new bolts through. So As you can hear, there's a train outside. The tracks are actually only like 30 yards away from the building, so it's kind of loud in here, but we got that hardware on, and then we're going to use our new provided hardware, both the bracket over to the sway bar over here. Alright, so with all the bolts in place on either side, the way I'm aligning this for now is basically just having the sway bar length straight up and down. So in that position, the sway bar has to be as forward as it can go on these brackets, so they're slid all the way forward within these slot holes in these bolts. So I'm going to leave it at that. I might have to go back later and adjust the angle, but for now I'm just going to tighten it up in this position. So I'm going to start with the 15mm stock bolts that go from the bracket to the frame, and then I'll tighten these new hardware bolts over here. And then lastly, I'll tighten up the bolts that go to our sway bar link. And the hardware size on these new bolts that we installed is going to be a 5/8. Okay, so once you get everything tightened on this side, you can repeat the process and tighten up all those bolts for the sway bar on the other side. Alright, so with the sway bar all taken care of, we're pretty much done for installing components. One last thing we got to do up here is torque down our lower control arm bolts, and we're going to torque that down to 85 foot-pounds. And if you guys saw my previous video on installing the rear lift, I still have to torque down those leaf spring bolts in the back. So I'm going to do that when I get full weight of the vehicle on the back. But right now, since we still got this on jack stands and there's still weight on the axle here, we can torque that down. Alright, now we can go ahead and reinstall our tires and wheels. Now we can torque down the wheels to 100 foot-pounds. Alright guys, that's going to be a wrap for today's video. We finished up the lift kit on this Jeep Cherokee XJ, and I'm very happy with the results I got. I got a true 3 inches from the front and the rear with those leaf packs in the rear. One thing I did off camera is I torqued down those leaf spring bolts once this Jeep was fully on the ground. Those front bolts for the leaf springs are going to be 115 foot-pounds, and the back 2 bolts for that shackle, they're going to be 80 foot-pounds. So now that the Jeep is all lifted up, it's in desperate need of alignment. I'm just going to get it kind of in the ballpark, but I'm not going to show you guys that. I did show how to get it in the ballpark a little bit when I installed the track bar in this a couple videos ago, so you guys can check that out as well if you want to know how to center your axle underneath your Jeep. Now this Jeep really needs tires as well. I'm thinking about 31, 32 inch all-terrain. If you guys have any ideas on wheel and tire combos, you guys can comment below and I'll take a look at that. But down the road, maybe 2 or 3 months, after I get some miles on the suspension, I'm going to do a review on the lift kit and review on the N3 shocks that I currently have installed. As you guys saw earlier, I also have those V2 monotube shocks that I'm going to be throwing on there as well, and then we'll see how they compare against these N3 series. So I want to thank Rough Country once again for making this video happen and for providing all the lift components. I'm going to post the links in the description where you guys can find everything that I used to install today, including all the miscellaneous stuff I decided to replace as well since I was in here. So it's about 8:45 at night, so that took me about 8 hours to install the front and rear lift on this Jeep. And that was including filming time, and I had to wait for the battery to charge up a little bit since it died on me. So you can easily get this done in your garage. You don't have to use a hoist at all to lift up the vehicle. I've done many lift kits with just using jack stands and a jack in a garage. So I hope you guys learned something. Make sure to check out the previous video if you haven't on installing the rear lift. I also got a separate video on installing that aftermarket track bar by Rough Country, and that's going to help get your front axle aligned underneath the vehicle. So I want to thank you guys for watching. If you guys have any questions or comments, make sure to post them below and I'll be happy to answer them. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.